and then they would use this wood to do things like make grape steaks, right? And just simple things that you could, So he just thought, wow, man, we're destroying these incredible trees for these ridiculous purposes, and that's incredibly wasteful, and we need to stop that. Anyway, so the conservationists, certainly have made important contributions to reducing waste. But according to Baxter, every human being is an end in herself, and no other beings are ends in themselves. All right, and then he gives you kind of this practical set of reasons for why that has to be the case. Only humans can be thought of as ends in themselves for all these different reasons. Right? He just goes through them one by one. No other view of what constitutes an end in itself corresponds to the way most people really think and act. Okay? It's just kind of a prudential argument, isn't it? This is just kind of how, this is how most people think and act. And so, even though, I guess what he's saying is that even though there might be something a little bit wrong or wrong-headed or defective about this way of thinking, it's just the way most people think and act. And so it's kind of the default way that we need to think and act. Right? Only humans are ends in themselves. The natural world will still be respected and preserved to the extent that doing so is necessary for human well-being. Okay? Now that might be an argument. There can be really strong arguments constructed on anthropocentric grounds, right? Let me just say that right off the bat. Very strong arguments that destruction of natural resources, anthropogenic climate destabilization, pollution in the ocean, all these things ultimately are going to come back and harm human beings. They already are, right? Big time harming us. With these extreme weather events, right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, there was a question. You asked that question, right? About human-centered. Who asked that question? No? Did that person depart? No. Anyway, never mind. Forget it. These are the reasons that Baxter thinks we just have to think about humans as being ends in themselves, and that's the only reasonable point of view. Okay? Because once we start saying that penguins, for example, are also ends in themselves, then we're making a metaphysical commitment. Right? This is kind of a nice argument. It makes sense, doesn't it? We're making a metaphysical, because not everybody agrees with that. Many people don't, right? Many people just, and yet everyone agrees that humans are ends in themselves. Right? And so, but to say that a redwood tree or a penguin is an end in itself is to make a metaphysical commitment that can't be sustained and that very few people would agree with. Whereas the metaphysical commitment that humans are ends in themselves, that also might be difficult to sustain, right? We don't know that. Who says that? Who says we're ends in themselves? Are you an end in yourself? Let's harvest your organs, If we could save 20 people by harvesting your organs, the only thing saving you is the idea that you're an end in yourself, right? If you're a utilitarian, would say, hey, harvest his organs, right? We're going to save 20 people, and he's the only one that's going to suffer. So that's good. Anyway, but it may be a difficult metaphysical commitment too, to say that humans are, but at least that's what we all believe, right? Why do we believe that? I don't know. You have the right to remain silent, right? Maybe we've just heard it enough times on cop shows, right? Anyway, sorry. My humor gets a little bit murky sometimes. All right. No other system is workable. All right? And it so happens that what is good for humans is also good for many non-humans, right? And as long as we can demonstrate, as long as we can muster some scientific evidence to show that something we're doing, for example, to the climate system is ultimately going to be really bad for us, then hey, okay, let's not do that anymore, right? But let's not pretend the climate system has moral status. Come on, that's just a hippy-dippy idea, right? That's what he's saying. Normative considerations. And the moral worth of non-humans cannot be fairly calculated, right? That's just another way of saying that's subjective, relativistic, right? Some real hippy-dippy person might, want to just hug the redwood tree and think it's just incredibly valuable. Whereas a logger, is just going to come along and say, hey, it's just a tree. So the moral worth of non-humans cannot be fairly calculated. What measure are we going to use? Right? That's a good point, isn't it? How are we going to objectively identify the moral worth of a non-human? Normative considerations are unique to human beings. They are meaningless when applied to non-humans. And then he gets in his little insult at, you might not have picked up on this, but he throws his little insult at Henry David Thoreau and all of Thoreau's hippy-dippy followers, It says, every man is entitled to his preferred definition of Walden Pond, but there is no definition that has any moral superiority over another except by reference to the selfish needs of the human race. There is no normative, healthy nature. Okay? That's what he's saying. There is no normative nature. All right? Anytime somebody comes along and tries to say this is the way nature is supposed to be, this is the norm, the natural norm, right? Then they're just some hippy-dippy weirdo who just doesn't really get it and is probably a freeloader, right? So, you know, like Henry David Thoreau. Every man is entitled to his preferred definition of Walden Pond, but there is no definition that has any moral superiority over another except by reference to the selfish needs of the human race. Okay? From the fact that there is no normative definition of the natural state, it follows that there is no normative definition of clean air or pure water or of pollution except by reference to the needs of man. Okay? That sums up his whole point of view. And it's a very powerful point of view that we have to take seriously. All right? And it has impeccable philosophical ancestry. So, you know, we shouldn't underestimate what we're up against here. If we are a little bit concerned about the Earth. Yeah.
So there's no other system being workable actually support that plan. So there's a couple ways you can interpret that.
I guess he means legally, politically, and economically. No other system is actually workable. The only system that's workable is a system which acknowledges moral and legal status in a human individual and nothing else. We'll soon read Christopher Stone's famous essay, Should Trees Have Standing, in which Christopher Stone proposes another legal / economic / political system involving guardianship and involving moral status in ecological wholes. We'll read that and we'll see that Christopher Stone has a very, very different point of view. And actually that may be a good day where we can bring these guys to confront each other. Christopher Stone versus William Baxter. All right. So we always have to make a choice, is what Baxter is. Ultimately, that's what it comes down to. We have to choose. If we want to preserve the penguin population in Antarctica, then that means we're going to have to regulate certain chemicals and certain industrial activities, and the cost of those activities and those chemicals is going to go up, right? And so people are going to have to pay more to get certain everyday household items, let's say, right? And that's bad, right? Because now some kid might go without something that he needs in order to benefit the penguins in Antarctica, right? So there's always a trade-off, right? Tax money is going to be taken away from schools and hospitals in order to stop some chemical from reaching the penguins, right? That's his argument. So he's not saying that he's not scoffing at the environmentalists. He's just suggesting that their point of view needs to be balanced out economically with the point of view of of everyone who benefits from inexpensive electricity, for example, inexpensive amenities, and inexpensive paper products. So what we really need to be striving for is an optimal level of pollution, an optimal level of environmental destruction, okay? Because not having any destruction at all is unthinkable, okay? So what we really need to be working toward is an optimal level of pollution. And this optimal level is reached by calculating the costs and benefits of pollution and pollution reduction, all right? There are costs of pollution, obviously, asthma, illnesses, and then there are aesthetic costs also, like just ugly haze over Los Angeles. But there are also benefits of not taking steps to reduce pollution. We have more money to invest in non-pollution related public goods, more money to invest in hospitals, schools, crime prevention, etc. Pollution reduction policy needs to be set by calculating trade-offs between the benefits of allowing pollution levels to remain where they are and the benefits of reducing pollution levels. All right, so and this is where I hope I indicate that I'm not saying that Baxter is an economic reductionist. He seems to be kind of wishy-washy. He admits that the measurement problem is really tough, okay? What is the measurement problem? It's the old measurement problem. If it's just the normative problem, the normative question: how do we measure the morally right thing to do with natural resources? I may be mistaken. It's been a while since I've read the essay very carefully. I've read it so many times, but I haven't read it recently. It seems to me that Baxter rejects economic reductionism, but he suggests that it's one possible solution to the measurement problem. How do we go about measuring the incremental units of human satisfaction yielded by different types of goods? All right? How do we measure something that's really hard to measure in economic terms? Ultimately, right, we have to figure that out too. How are we going to measure the value of a view shed? How are we going to measure the value of an old-growth forest, of preserving an old-growth forest? Anyway, this is the solution that the economic reductionist proposes for any kind of conflict in natural resource management. Assign a monetary value to all goods of every type. Okay? All these different kinds of goods. Right? Illness prevention, wilderness preservation, urban beautification, quality of life. Some of these are going to be very hard to assign a monetary value to. But economists suggest different ways of doing that. For example, economists use these willingness to pay surveys, right? Use willingness to pay surveys to estimate the dollar value of intangible goods, such as the quality of life and aesthetic benefits. All right. So anyway, you calculate the benefits and you calculate the costs. And if the benefits exceed the costs, then, right, you know the story. And it's very simple. I don't think it needs to be elaborated any further. Quantify all environmental values and disvalues in anthropocentric, instrumental, and economic terms, and then use strict cost-benefit analyses to determine the right course of action. Economic reductionism lends itself very nicely to efforts by developers and resource extractivists to justify development and extraction of natural resources. From an economic reductionist point of view, I think the O'Shaughnessy Dam and the submergence of Hetch Hetchy were perfectly reasonable. And I think it seems as though many congressmen who voted on that believed that. Anyway, I refer to the Mineral King Valley, and this is the natural resource management topic that I really want to postpone until we read Christopher Stone. But what happened there, just real briefly, what happened, this is another alpine valley, actually about 150 miles south of Yosemite. And in those days, it was just outside of Sequoia National Park, and a ski resort was proposed to be built there. And by the Walt Disney Corporation. Walt Disney Corporation was going to build this giant ski resort in this beautiful alpine valley that was just outside the boundary line of Sequoia National Park. In fact, originally it had been considered to be included within that national park, but then it got left out. Anyway, and then so it was Forest Service land. It was just Forest Service land, but many backpackers and nature enthusiasts went there a lot, used it. It's a very popular place for a long time, since the 1920s, I think. People have been using it for backpacking. Anyway, it would have been really a good place for a ski resort too, though. But they were going to build a 4-lane highway through there. And so anyway, these environmentalists sued, and what ended up happening in the long run was Congress took that land out of the Forest Service's hands and expanded the boundaries of Sequoia National Park, and it was preserved. So it's exactly the opposite of what happened with Hetch Hetchy. And this all went down in the late 60s and throughout the 70s. Finally, in 1979, I believe it was, Congress passed a law that took this land, the Mineral King Valley, away from the Forest Service and gave it over to the Park Service and put it inside that Sequoia National Park. So it's been preserved. So it's kind of the opposite of what happened, right? With Yosemite, a place inside the park was condemned and destroyed, right, by economic reductionistic thinking. Certainly Group A conservationist / utilitarian thinking, right? And then when it came to the Mineral King Valley, about 50 years later, the exact opposite occurred, where a natural resource was preserved and included inside of a national park on the basis of the kinds of arguments that John Muir was making, the kinds of arguments that Aldo Leopold was making. All right. So you see how that works? But think about this. Who pays more into the local economy? A backpacker or a downhill skier? Skier. Isn't that obvious, right? I mean, all of my questions are really obvious, by the way. Almost all of them. Sometimes I'll throw out a tough one. But don't hesitate to answer my questions if they seem like the answer is obvious. Then it is. But yeah, so if you were an economic reductionist and you were faced with this moral struggle over Hetch Hetchy or over the Mineral King Valley, let's just stick with the Mineral King Valley, right? You would say, hey, come on, man. Skiers invest far more into the economy. They're going to pay a lot more money, and we're going to have a lot more jobs, a lot more economic development, and so it's a no-brainer, right? In fact, it's so much of a no-brainer that you might be puzzled as to how on earth, in the 1960s and 1970s, the environmentalist point of view could have won the day, right? Because it seems to go so strongly against the thinking that, anyway, it seems to be obvious. All right, but we've got one last little story to go over. I guess that's my very last slide for the day. And I got this, I don't think it arrived yet because I didn't get an email, but I was going to bring this movie over. I got part one, which was about what happened in Hetch Hetchy. And then part two of this, it's called Wild by Law. Maybe we'll watch part of it on Tuesday, I don't know. But I was hoping to watch part of it today if we had time, and we do have time. So now I'll just have to go over what happened. And I didn't even have anything from the internet, so I'll just talk about it, I guess. This other natural resource management topic that I want to squeeze in today's lecture is about a place in Utah, northern Utah, called Dinosaur National Monument, and which is right by the Green River flows through there, and the Green River empties out into the Colorado. And starting in the 1940s, the Bureau of Reclamation, which built all the Colorado River dams, realized or decided that they needed some storage capacity in the upper Colorado River basin to balance out the dams that they had in the lower. Usually engineers, if you look at river systems, you'll see that engineers like, if they've got some dams in the lower section of a river basin, they want to have some up higher too, so they can control the flow, control the whole river. Anyway, so they needed some upper basin dams, and the Green River was identified as a really good candidate. And so actually there were two dams proposed that would have submerged this national monument. National monuments are Park Service land, right? But they're separate. They're not actually national parks, but they're within the system of the national park right there, and they're administered by the National Park Service. And this, I guess, Dinosaur National Monument started out really small, and it was literally a place where these archaeologists found an intact dinosaur skeleton, totally intact. Anyway, in the 1920s, a long time ago, and so Congress designated it, and it was just really small, but eventually it grew. It got bigger, right? Congress set aside more land because it was a popular place. It was very beautiful. It was popular among river rafters who like to go rafting down the Green River. Anyway, so the Bureau of Reclamation proposed these two dams to be constructed on the Green River. Echo Park Dam and one other, I forget the name of the other dam. But these dams were going to submerge sections of the Green River and the Nampa River, another river that flowed into the Green River. And we're going to just inundate this really pretty section of river and the valley, Anyway, so Bernard DeVoto, who was a famous writer, kind of a nature writer and a historian of Lewis and Clark too, by the way. He wrote a good book on Lewis and Clark. Anyway, but he had a column in the Washington Post. The Saturday Evening Post, I think it was called. Very, very popular newspaper. And he had a weekly column in that national publication, right? Everyone read it. And he had this famous article in there called "Shall We Let Them Ruin Our National Parks?" And because he caught on to what they were planning, what the Bureau of Reclamation was planning. And this was a national monument, So, you know, the title of his essay was a little bit misleading, but it was national park land, and they were planning on destroying it, right? So everyone read this article, and all of a sudden people started realizing what was happening, and this was in 1948 when he published this article, Shall We Let Them Ruin Our National Parks? And then David Brower in the Sierra Club found out about it, and he started organizing these raft trips, and everyone started lobbying Congress. And within 4 years, Congress held a vote on whether or not to authorize and provide funding for these 2 dams, and they were defeated. The dams were defeated, and the national monument was preserved. But what's interesting to think about too, we might just end up going home early today, I don't know. What's interesting thing, right in the same time period, there's another dam was being built. Between 1950 and 1957. So roughly the same time period. You know, the movement to stop the dams in Utah got really, you know, people were really organized. And environmentalists, I think 30 or 40 different prominent American environmental and resource conservation nonprofit groups came together, all of them opposed to these dams, right? So the environmental community was extremely active when it came to preserving a very remote section of northeastern Utah, right? And at the same time period, in the same time, right here on the Columbia River, the Corps of Engineers was constructing the Dalles Dam. And they were holding hearings, in fact, throughout 1948. They were holding public hearings, you know, throughout the Northwest, where they were taking comments from whoever was interested about their proposal to construct the Dalles Dam and submerge and destroy Celilo Falls, which is the most famous and most beloved fishing site in the world, salmon fishing site, and was used since time immemorial by the indigenous fishermen and women. For at least 14,000 years they've been harvesting fish there. And all up and down, really, not just Celilo Falls, but actually Bonneville Dam, which was constructed in 1936, flooded hundreds more sites too. The whole section of the Columbia River from where Bonneville Dam now stands all the way to the Dalles was white water. It was mostly white water, very turbulent. And these were the places where it was very easy to catch salmon as the salmon were making their way upstream, because the salmon had to go along certain routes. The fishers would know this, and they build their little platforms right there, you know, and they catch hundreds and hundreds of big, giant fish, you know, every day during fishing, you know, during season. But this place, you know, and not a single environmentalist showed up. Not a single representative of the Sierra Club showed up, or any other environmental organization showed up at these hearings that they held in Walla Walla and throughout the Northwest when they talked about constructing the Dalles Dam and these other dams on the Columbia and the Snake Rivers. And yet when it came to this remote area in Utah, the environmental community was activized. You know, they were all over it, and they put a stop to it. And yet none of them stepped up here and tried to put a stop to the Dalles Dam. It's just kind of interesting. Now I'm going to talk about Celilo Falls later on in the term. And in fact, I might even have a friend come and talk about Celilo Falls. But anyway, so that's not, you don't have to worry about Celilo Falls right now. But I like whenever I talk about, because it happened at the same time. It's just something to consider. You know, what was the difference? You know, why was that section of the mid-Columbia River a sacrifice zone? Why was it viewed as a sacrifice zone? Where, you know, where all the beauty. Go to pictures online. The most photogenic place in the world is what Wilma Roberts, one of the more famous Celilo Falls photographers, said about it. Is everywhere you went around there was a beautiful picture. It's just it was also the most popular tourist destination right up until it got flooded. 1957, March of 1957 is when it was submerged finally. And anyway, but a lot of beauty, a lot of scenic beauty. You know, look at the photographs, you'll see what I mean. You know, you might wonder, Well, they preserved the Grand Canyon, and they preserved all these other places that are really beautiful, Yosemite, and yet they didn't preserve Celilo Falls. And why is that? Probably racism had something to do with that, or a lot to do with it. Racism and theft of resources from from other people. But they're still there. You can still see them. They have to use gill nets now. But they still live there. The river people still live there, and but they can't fish. They can't fish in the old way anymore. So anyway, wilderness preservation was all well and good for a conservationist if it had, when it came to a remote area that people weren't counting on to build a big hydropower generating facility, right? Well, we need this hydropower generating, we need this dam, right? It's going to generate a lot of electricity, and we also need the navigation channel, right? That was the argument. We need the navigation channel because we want to be able to navigate with big ships all the way up the river. So, and then now they can do that, right? 700 miles. Lewiston, Idaho is a seaport. Isn't that bizarre? Lewiston, Idaho is a seaport because of what we've done to the river. But Dinosaur was a victory, for another victory, for the first great victory, really, for the Sierra Club. Well, not the first, they had a lot of victories, but a major victory for the Sierra Club and for environmentalists. But there's also a very sad epilogue, a sad epilogue to that story, because instead of when those dams were part of the argument presented to Congress was that the location of those two proposed dams that dams could be dams if they need upper basin storage capacity, then they can get it somewhere else, right? And so anyway, David Brower proposed a compromise. He was the executive director of the Sierra Club, right? Really passionate guy. And he proposed a compromise. He said, you can build a dam down there on the Colorado, and you'll get just as much storage capacity as if you build it up here. In fact, instead of having to build two dams, you can only build one. Well, guess what dam that had turned out to be? Glen Canyon Dam. And nobody in the Sierra Club had even explored those little slot canyons and all that beauty in there, all that beauty underneath that big reservoir that they named after John Wesley Powell, Lake Powell. That's another way of grinding people's faces into the dirt, all right? Because John Wesley Powell would never have approved of that. He would have said, that's crazy. Anyway, John Wesley Powell was the first guy that rafted down the Colorado River, and he was the first director of the U.S. Geological Survey, the USGS. Very, very powerful man. And if he had had his way in developing water resources, none of that stuff that we did to the Colorado River ever would have been done. But they named the lake after him because he's a famous guy, right? Lake Powell. Anyway.
It would definitely be a national park today if it wasn't.
If it hadn't been flooded.
Yeah.
Yeah. So David Brower went to his grave feeling guilty. That's what he said. He volunteered that information. Anybody who cares to listen, he just flat out says, that's the greatest regret of my life, and I never should have done it. But he did. Does anyone have any questions about Baxter, about how all this works? What else do we need to talk about today? I'm just moving along. I anticipated having to move along fairly briskly. And I'm moving along too briskly, evidently. But for Tuesday, you're going to read Aldo Leopold, and it's very difficult to underestimate Aldo Leopold's contribution to North American environmental ethics. And anybody who wants to read a magnificent book, really, it's just a magnificent book in all genres of literature, but it's a really good biography of Aldo Leopold, and it's written by a guy named Kurt Mine, and it's just called, I think it's called Aldo Leopold, His Life and Work, I believe. Anyway, but it's a really good, if you want to read a really good, I should have underlined this instead, but anyway, if you want to read a really good biography of Aldo Leopold, there are several out there, and they're all good, but this is the best. I read that 2 summers ago, and it's really captivated me. And it educated me about how involved he was. Aldo Leopold was one of the co-founders of the Wilderness Society, along with a couple other prominent early conservationists. In the 1930s, the Wilderness Society is not as well known as the Sierra Club, obviously, but it's one of the leading environmental organizations in the United States, co-founded by Aldo Leopold. Aldo Leopold was also a hunter and a fisherman. Why don't we go ahead and read while I have time here? Why don't we go ahead and read, this would be a good introduction to Leopold, since we're not watching a movie, that also would have been a good introduction to Leopold. Let's get some wolves howling up here. Yes, go ahead.
Maybe I just missed it. Is the sign-in sheet still going around?
Oh, no, it's not. I'm sorry. Thank you very much for reminding me. Thank you very much. See, that's my administrative deficiencies, because I just want to do philosophy. I don't want to, but obviously I have to do some administrative work otherwise. All right, so let's get some wolfies. No, what's that? Oh, no. Okay. All right, so I'm going to read, it won't take very long, I'm going to read Aldo Leopold's famous little essay called Thinking Like a Mountain. Okay. So, Aldo Leopold, this is included in a Sand County Almanac, this little essay. A Sand County Almanac was published in 1949. It was written between about 1946 and 1948 when Aldo died. Aldo died at age 61, very prematurely and suddenly of a heart attack. But he had just finished the material that was later published posthumously as the Sand County Almanac, which is the Bible of the environmental movement. Later, it took a while for it to catch on. It was published in 1949, but it didn't really become popular until about 20 years later. But this essay is included, and all the material in the Sand County Almanac is written between about 1945 and 1948. All right, so, and what I've asked you to read for Tuesday is the concluding chapter of a Sand County Almanac. Okay, the land ethics, the last chapter in a Sand County Almanac. This is one of the earlier essays in that book. And this is written at the encouragement of his friend, who reminded him that he had been responsible for spearheading. He didn't need reminding. I mean, he was in charge of the